You're listening to the Arts on the Edge podcast. Each month, we'll be bringing you stories from the nonprofit American Voices, who for the last 30 years have been building arts programs in some of the world's most conflict-ridden nations, changing young people's lives with music and performing arts, and connecting people across cultural and linguistic lines. To learn more about American Voices and how you can help this kind of programming thrive, please visit www.americanvoices.org. Thanks for tuning in. My name is Ben Wright. Our first episode is a wild ride, introducing listeners to American Voices founder John Ferguson and following his journey as one of the first musicians to slip behind the Iron Curtain as it was falling. John's early experiences with music shaped the mission of American Voices and built a foundation for a growing roster of artists who now travel around the world to places like Turkmenistan and Eritrea, creating remarkable experiences off the beaten path.
So American Voices is a not-for-profit organization. We're based in the United States. We're soon to enter our 30th year of existence in 2022. We started with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe after the Berlin Wall had come down and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union had become more open to cultural exchange with the West and ideas from the West. So originally our focus was on countries like the former Eastern Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, and the Baltic states, for example. Over time, we expanded that focus to some of the more far-flung areas of the world that were quite influenced by Eastern Europe. So the former Soviet republics such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. From there, in 1998, which was the George Gershwin centennial, was the year we got a real boost in interest in our work and started going to the Middle East, Oman, Kuwait, Syria, Lebanon, and then eventually into countries in Africa and Latin and South America as well.
Mm-hmm. And so what kind of programming does American Voices do currently?
Well, a long answer to your question. So in the beginning, American Voices was a very small roster of classically trained musicians such as myself. I'm a pianist, performing American composers with an emphasis on the 19th and 20th century. So contemporary music for the most part, but also Broadway composers and 19th century composers. And we had a small jazz roster featuring artists such as Coco York, a jazz and blues singer currently based in LA, and Mike Del Ferro, an American-Dutch jazz pianist based in Amsterdam. So really, we were quite small in the beginning. There wasn't a lot of funding available in those days, and we had a sort of limited geographic range of our programs and the kinds of programs we did. And they were mostly performance-based. It was all about touring and performing at festivals and, special occasions and so forth. Over time, we've shifted more to an educational model. And I would say our flagship program is the Yes Academy, Youth Excellence on Stage. That started originally in Taiwan with Broadway academies and voice academies and classical piano academies. And then in 2007 took a great leap into a summer conservatory program based in Iraq. So that was when, from 2007 on, when I made the conscious decision to shift the organization from a programming model to a programming and educational model. And we started to grow those educational programs like Yes Academy, and then the Bridges programs, Broadway Bridges, Jazz Bridges, a hip-hop diplomacy and engagement program we call Hiplomacy. So now those are some of our main streams of programming.
So you went from being a performer to leading this organization in using music education, right?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about your early days as a performer. You were talking about Eastern Bloc countries, is that correct?
Right.
What was that like? How did you end up performing in an Eastern Bloc country?
Well, okay, so as a pianist, I was really trained in the European classics, the Bach, Beethoven, Brahms. I had a kind of specialization in my university days in French composers because I had studied in France when I was young in the summers with a woman named Nadia Boulanger. And I studied with her in 78, 79 when I was still a teenager. But she at that point was in her 80s, but she had taught great composers like Aaron Copland and Philip Glass and so forth. So it was quite an illustrious studio and history of her studio. But I came from a very, classical background. I'm not an improviser. I'm not a kind of a crossover person. But after I graduated, my first job was in North Carolina as something called a North Carolina visiting artist. And the state of North Carolina placed 50 visiting artists in the 50 community colleges that were spread across the state. So my first job was in Appalachia, in Clyde, North Carolina. We jokingly called it the University of South Clyde, but it was actually Haywood Tech. It was a technical university. And I was an artist in residence based on that campus, but, reaching out into the community, working in public schools, working with different local arts organizations, performing at festivals, all different kinds of community events. And that really opened my mind to the power of community organizing through the arts and using your art form to bring people together and as an educational force in the community. So that really was my first job that kind of set me on this path as both a performer and a kind of community activist, if you will.
You're talking about music bringing people together. Do you remember any moment from those days that struck you?
Well, there were a lot of them. I guess for me, it was eye-opening in 1984 to be, I grew up in Houston, Texas. Houston was a big, modern, kind of rich city, based on energy and so forth. And then suddenly I was in Western North Carolina where there was no symphony orchestra, no opera house, and very few piano teachers and so forth. And going back into these, two-room schoolhouses and places like Fines Creek, which, my last name is Ferguson, and Fines Creek was the redoubt of all the Fergusons in Haywood County. And, playing in these two-room schoolhouses for a group of kids who ranged in age from kindergarten to high school. So you would have 5-year-olds in your audience and 18-year-olds in your audience. And, how do you engage that wide of an age range?
Right.
And so it really started affecting my repertoire. I arrived at that job with a repertoire that was heavily based on the classics, but quickly started warming up my audiences with ragtime, George Gershwin's songbook, arrangements of his Broadway songs, pieces like Rhapsody in Blue and so forth. So another part of that job that was interesting was required collaboration with other visiting artists in the system. So I hooked up with Paula Lark, who's a storyteller from Alabama. And suddenly I didn't feel like a storyteller when I watched her telling her stories about, Southern African American culture. I was like, well, what are my stories? And I wasn't sure. I was really challenged by that. But working with her opened my mind and eyes to how, as a classical pianist, I had stories to tell. Worked with a painter, Andrew Braitman, combining music with art expositions and some improvisation where I would improvise while he painted. And
so you did improvise?
Well, in a kind of classical contemporary sense, yes, but I'm not a jazz improviser. So one particular project I remember was with a ballet dancer named Ann Dunn, who's still with the Asheville Ballet, also a professor at University of North Carolina at Asheville. We did a program I had suggested called Gospel Christmas, where we united a gospel choir from a local church in Asheville, North Carolina, with her dancers, modern ballet dancers from Asheville Ballet, and did a program of jazz arrangements of Christmas carols, choreographies to music by Olivier Messiaen, very kind of mystical, with themes of the Nativity, and gospel music. So it was the goal of that was to try to bring a audience together in a very racially divided city that represented the African American community and the sort of mostly Caucasian concert-going community. And we did that successfully.
Yeah.
And it was noted as one of the first mixed audience kinds of programs that was featuring dance and mostly classical music. And, programs like that sought to bring diverse audiences together. I also felt very vindicated in my second year in that program, creating a community choir in Haywood County that brought Methodist and Baptist together. That was a huge cultural victory because the Methodists and Baptists kind of politely sniped at each other, and never sang together in any kind of mixed choir. But we brought those people together, had a very successful community choir for a couple of years. And everyone commented on how nice it was to see Methodist and Baptist, singing in the same choir. That had never happened before in Haywood County. And that was something I would draw upon later, an experience I would draw upon later when I was bringing Arabs and Kurds and Christians and Muslims together in places like Iraq.
So you took those experiences to Europe with you in your head, and those helped shape some of the stuff you started doing internationally?
Yeah. After this North Carolina program, they booted you out after 4 years. You weren't allowed to stay more than four consecutive years. And then they booted you out because it was really, the idea was this was for emerging young artists and then move you on after 4 years. But I gained so much performance experience and realized later how much I'd learned from just being on stage, 200 times a year, even if it was for fifth graders in Fines Creek or for, the ladies reading club of Canton, North Carolina. So you learn so much from being thrust into those challenging performance environments. As a pianist, you don't always have a good piano, or you don't always have an audience that's really receptive. So you have to find ways, to reach your audience. So I learned a lot from that. Moved to Paris in 1989 after leaving the North Carolina program, and was thrust into a very performance-centric scene where I was working with agents and a chamber music group and big festivals. So suddenly the tenor of the performances was very different, big concert halls, Théâtre de la Ville, and your name up in headlights on outside of theaters. And it was kind of a shock, but I was thinking to myself, well, this is what I was trained to do. But that started a period of about 1989, about 10 years. It was really focused on, how should I say, the sort of more professional end of the performing spectrum, concerts and festivals and so forth. Again, took my skills acquired in North Carolina, worked with the Yehudi Menuhin Foundation, which did a lot of performances in the community and small festivals out in the countryside and so forth, trying to reach the underserved audiences, mostly in France.
Is that a French organization?
Yeah, Yehudi Menuhin was a famous classical violinist, and in his later years founded a foundation to give young performing artists opportunities to develop their craft through performance. So worked with them, organization Jeunesse Musicale, musical youth, touring France, cities big and small with an American program.
Do you speak French?
Yeah.
Fluently?
Yeah, I had actually studied in France in the summers in 79 and 78, and then actually studied the language in university. And then when I moved back to France, by that point, I had already studied in Geneva, Switzerland, which was French-speaking, for a couple of years on a Rotary scholarship and was already fluent. So it was actually an easy shift for me to move to France because I already knew the language and could function and understood everything that was happening around me.
So you performed professionally for 10 years, like in theaters and stuff like that?
And this was around the time that American Voices was born. So I moved to Europe in 89. The following year, with one of my chamber music friends, we went to the French equivalent of the American Performing Arts Presenters Conference, APAP, and started talking to a guy carrying a saxophone case who had long blonde hair, and he was a saxophonist from Latvia, which at that time was still part of the Soviet Union. And he said, "Oh, this is so nice to meet you guys. What do you do?" And we told him about our American programming. And he's like, "Well, I'm going to invite you to Latvia." And then we exchanged cards, and off he went. And then 3 months later, there was like this telex, which is an ancient technology that people used before faxes and email. There was a telex saying, "Go to the embassy of the Soviet Union in Paris and pick up your tickets and your visas for our festival."
Wow.
And so we did that and thought we were going to the Soviet Union to learn some Russian, and went on a 3-day train trip that took us to Poland, and then to Lithuania, and then to Latvia. It took 3 days to get there. But the Soviet trains were wonderful in those days. You got like a nice, big, comfortable bed, and people brought you tea, and it was very comfortable, very luxurious in a way, which we hadn't expected for the Soviet Union. And practiced our Russian on the way, and then got there to find out we were performing at a Latvian independence festival, and quickly started learning some Latvian. So anybody who wants to know some Latvian, labdien, good day, is a good way to start, and paldies, thank you, is a good way. So, and we're treated like rock stars. And actually, of all of that performing I'd been doing at that time in Europe, in festivals and so forth, to these kind of overfed, oversaturated audiences, suddenly you were in a place where there was just a huge thirst for Americans performing American music. And our program was Copland and Bernstein and some contemporary composers like Philip Glass and Sidney Hodgkinson. And audiences ate all of that up and really, really, really appreciated what we did. And we went and performed in Latvian music schools, children's music schools. And I said, well, we do this in France all the time. We better keep the program short because the kids get so wild, and they don't like to listen. And so let's just plan on 30 minutes. I said, oh, no, do a 90-minute program. Do your full program. The kids will listen, we promise. And sure enough, the kids had a completely different relationship with music and with listening and with being in an audience. And it's like, I want to do more of this because these were the kind of audiences that you almost never found in Western Europe or in the States. And was, kind of exposed to this whole Soviet system of music schools and government-supported concert halls. And there was very little dumbing down of the culture to reach more people. It was like, people have to be disciplined and they have to lift themselves up to take part in these kinds of events. And Riga had like 40 children's music schools. It was just...
And this was all funded by the
Soviet Union, yeah.
And like they knew you were Americans coming in.
Well, it was perestroika. It was the age of openness. And then 1 year later, Latvia, the next time we went back, Latvia was independent by that point. So we went back 3 times to the Baltics as an ensemble in 89, 90, and 91. And each year was completely different from the previous year. 90, 91, and 92. Each year was different. The first time was the Soviet Union. The second time was like literally 3 weeks after independence. And nobody knew what was going on, neither us nor the locals. And then the following year, it was... independence, but a very rough independence where there were food shortages and energy shortages and, supply chains completely disrupted by the, disruption of the Soviet Union system. Those countries now are completely normal, sparkling Western European nations to visit, quite successful, quite progressive, quite open-minded. But back in those early days, it was a little bit difficult in a lot of ways.
Did you feel that when you were there? Like I'm watching history unfold.
Well, once we realized we were performing for an independence festival, it's like, okay, so we're all for independence now. As Americans, you were raised to believe that the Soviet Union was the root of all evil.
Absolutely.
But then you saw that that wasn't true.
You okay?
Yeah. Ooh, trip down memory lane here.
Oh. Tell me what tripped you up.
So you realize you've been fed a whole line of propaganda. You realize you've been fed a whole lot of propaganda about a system that, had its faults like every political system, but in terms of the arts was very successful,
Mm-hmm.
To see an excellent educational system that far surpassed anything in the States, to see so many music schools where the goal was not so much to create, 1,000 soloists, but to create educated people who knew how to listen, who knew how to question, who knew, I think in some ways, how to negotiate life in a more educated way was quite eye-opening. And again, I just wanted more of that. So that's when basically American Voices was born at that point, with the idea to bring these more authentic experiences of American culture to audiences that were deprived of opportunities to meet Americans. So at that point, as the walls were coming down, there was a huge rush of Eastern European musicians to take up the roles in opera houses and to conduct the orchestras and so forth. So there was a big rush from east to west, but very little from west to east. It's what the Eastern Europeans used to call the Golden Curtain, the Iron Curtain being replaced with a Golden Curtain. So that was really the motivation to start American Voices, was to bring programs to audiences who were thirsty for it, And I realized that as much as performing at festivals and so forth in Western Europe was our bread and butter, it wasn't very soul-satisfying to perform for what I like to call these overfed, oversatiated audiences who clapped politely.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, enjoyed what was going on, but they weren't just hungry for what we were able to offer. So American Voices beginning unofficially was back in 1990 in the Baltic countries, and that quickly started to grow over time as word got around American embassies and consulates in the east of Europe that there was an American group based in Europe, so not so expensive to fly in. You could even take the train most of the places we were going.
Mm-hmm.
And had some good ideas for thematic-based programs. So one of the early programs we did was in Prague with the Dvorak Museum, and did a musical program based on music that Dvorak would have heard when he was in the United States for 2 years in the 1890s. We developed a jazz program called Jazz from J to Z, which took audiences from the beginnings of jazz and West African traditions to the musical traditions that developed during the times of slavery. And
wow, how did you do that? Like, how did you fold in West African stuff? Did you have?
Well, the jazz singer Annette Lohman, she's still singing, based in Portland now, but she was living in Paris at the time. Performed a lot with Archie Shepp and the jazz greats of the time in the sort of Paris jazz scene.
The way, don't be afraid of loving me. The thought of this old loneliness goes whenever two can dream a dream together. So,
it was a program she and I worked on together, and the percussion writer had djembe in it and so forth, so you would make sure there were some African traditional instruments available for the drummer to play.
Wow.
It was again a program that was enjoyable, but it also had an educational aspect that audiences often didn't know, American audiences often don't know how jazz and these African American traditions came to pass. And so this was the kind of reputation we developed in the beginning and started working with American embassies in 1991, as I remember.
Can you give a little context as to why an embassy would, or the history behind cultural programming with, the State Department and stuff like that? Because not everybody knows that goes on,
This is interesting because it's like the history of cultural diplomacy kind of starts in the 1950s when State Department created the Jazz Ambassadors Program, sending, world famous artists like Louis Armstrong and Dizzy Gillespie and Duke Ellington abroad to represent the United States, especially in countries that were aligned with the Soviet Union or non-aligned, and trying to get more countries lured into the sort of Western ideology. But it was a great program, non-political for the most part. There was a lot of touring to countries like Congo and Egypt and the former Soviet Union and so forth. So it's very not a program that focused on, London, Tokyo, and Singapore, but really on more hardcore places, and often going to countries where there were no such thing as sound systems and so forth.
Right.
Very interesting program. The next big development, I think, in cultural diplomacy that I'm aware of was under Ronald Reagan. And I forget exactly what that program was called, but it's something like the Arts Envoy program now, that would send artists abroad, again, especially to underserved countries, to represent the United States. So what America was looking for was for artists to tell the American story, basically, as part of their outreach to the world through the American centers that existed at the time. The government had a separate wing, separate from State Department, U.S. Information Service,
yes,
which had a kind of ominous sounding name.
Yes.
Like, you shall be given information and you shall believe it.
Right.
But actually they were basically American centers that were all over the world, whose, provided libraries, free access to information. This was before the days of internet and so forth, but would bring over guest speakers, guest performers, judges from the American judicial system, people to talk about various aspects of American life. And the cultural programs were always the most popular. So this was very big in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, these American centers. And then in the 80s, there was a renewed focus on making more cultural programming available. And then between 81 and 92, once the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell, our Congress, in their infinite wisdom, led by Jesse Helms and his infinite ugliness, decided that this whole system was too expensive and that the American centers had to be closed. We had won the Cold War. There was no more need for America to explain itself because we were triumphant, and so on and so forth. So ironically, just about the time our programs were heating up, after the election of Bill Clinton, there started to be a lot of political attacks on State Department and U.S. Information Service, because U.S. Information Service allowed free dialogue about America, and some of the speakers would say things that could be considered as negative about the United States or various aspects of the American system. Jesse Helms didn't like that, and it took him a while, but by 1998 he had succeeded in having the U.S. Information Service folded into the State Department. And U.S. Information Service became the public affairs sections that we have now in U.S. embassies.
Interesting.
And so these public affairs sections have educational and cultural affairs sections there. So that's the part of the State Department system that we work with now. But in the beginning, it was a completely separate service, and you didn't work so much with embassies and ambassadors as with these American centers.
We'll be right back with more from the Arts on the Edge podcast. Please make sure to follow American Voices on social media. On Facebook, that's at AM Voices, and on Instagram, you can find us at American.Voices. Any and all donations help us continue to grow our educational programming for youth around the world and even help us provide scholarships to students, which we'll be talking about more in future episodes. To learn more about American Voices and how you can get involved, please visit www.americanvoices.org. I've been lucky enough to do a fair amount of this work, certainly not as much as you, but I've done a fair amount of it. And I always feel like it's important to say that every time we go on one of these trips, somebody says to us, your job is not to represent the U.S. government when you go on these trips. Your job is to represent American citizens,
Right.
Which makes it a lot easier to do than if we were there to... I think there's certainly reasons that they bring us over to just have something to talk to other diplomats about. But I think you and I share this belief that it's the individual connections that we make with people on these trips that are the most valuable part of them, and it's...
Yeah, it's the people-to-people connections. But these programs have, various diplomatic functions as well in some cases. I can remember when Ross Wilson, he was ambassador to Turkey, he said, these things are so important. They're so useful for us because it allows us just to get together with our, Ministry of Foreign Affairs colleagues and just change the subject for a while and not try to talk each other into some agreement about trade or, politics or whatever, but just to enjoy music together, understand more about the United States. And it provides a more seductive atmosphere that can lead to more open conversations about the current diplomatic issues at hand. So in that sense, these programs can be useful just to create a more open space and relaxed space for dialogue.
Yeah, I'm jealous of the early years of you doing that. As the Iron Curtain fell, I think you were sometimes the first American culture that people got, that honestly, that they weren't sneaking into the country. You were a real human being, just like, you were just moved by thinking about your experience and think about their experience, meeting an American who they've been told their whole lives, the source of all evil, and to have an American and a Russian share a performance space. I get it. I get why your life changed. And I can see how that's more interesting than playing in theaters in France,
Oh, yeah. And more, my role as a piano soloist. So as a pianist, I had a program called Variations on America. And I would start the program with some ragtime compositions by Scott Joplin, because I thought you have to start with the African-American tradition, because they were the great motor of American culture from the beginning, to current day. All the innovations in popular culture almost always come from African-American traditions. So I started with ragtime, and then I would jump back into the 19th century pre-ragtime and perform the American Chopin, Louis Moreau Gottschalk, and some other 19th century composers who wrote based on Native American themes, and then get into the 20th century. So ragtime, stride, early jazz composers, Broadway composers, George Gershwin, and then go into American contemporary music. But every piece I chose had to tell a story somehow. So if I was playing Rhapsody in Blue, the talk was not only about the innovations of Rhapsody in Blue, but how George Gershwin was the first to make jazz acceptable in the concert hall, Or Frederick Chevsky's A Living American Composer, a piece he wrote about cotton mills and the fate of cotton mill workers in the Deep South in Mississippi, Winsboro Cotton Mill Blues. Or U.B. Blake, who lived to be, I think, 99 years old, and at age 95, he wrote a piece called Rhapsody in Ragtime, which summed up all of the genres and styles he encountered in his 95 years of living. And at the end of his life, he was on stage with Tina Turner, crazy things like that. But all of that started to feel a little bit like not the most important thing anymore, but finding ways to tell the story of the unique American genres, and started getting more into Broadway more into jazz, more into hip hop in particular. By the year 2000, we were developing jazz festivals, starting in Azerbaijan, then later in Kazakhstan.
So how do you just start a jazz festival in Azerbaijan?
Well, you start. So Azerbaijan became one of my pet projects in 1997. Went as a piano soloist and then went back a second time with a jazz singer. And we did collaborations with Azerbaijani traditional music called mugam. Mugam meaning makam, the Arabic scales, so the Middle Eastern scales. There was a tradition of pastoral workers, shepherds, men singing in a tenor voice these traditional love stories and kind of Sufi poetry, religious poetry, in a very high voice. And we decided to pair the mugam musicians with jazz musicians and did a program called Jazz Mugam. And again, an African-American singer, Coco York, in Azerbaijan was something completely new and rare, and, huge numbers of people flocked to see her, and the musicians were so excited to collaborate with like a real jazz musician from the United States, especially an African-American. So that led to over 4 years building up our presence in Azerbaijan to where the business interest wanted to support us. There was a huge development of an oil pipeline out of Azerbaijan into Turkey. So the energy industry in Azerbaijan became a big supporter of the jazz festival. So between 2002 and 2005, we ran enormous jazz festival that took place over 4 nights, four very full nights of 6 hours of concerts per night, highlighting Azerbaijani jazz composers. There was a kind of local jazz mugam tradition, as well as bringing in large numbers of Americans, headline artists like Toots Thielemans and Maynard Ferguson. Everyone thought Maynard Ferguson, I was hiring my uncle or something like that, but I had to convince them, no, this wasn't a family thing. And we made everything free because Azerbaijanis worked for, average person made $1 a day, like $30 a month back then. Now the country's transformed by that pipeline and the energy resources they have, and people make real salaries now. But I knew if we charged admission, it would become a festival only for the elite, and I wanted everyone to be able to attend. So we made the festival completely free, completely funded by donations from corporate sponsors and the U.S. Embassy, and put together like a really exciting lineup of headline artists and jazz artists from Europe and the United States and Azerbaijani musicians as well.
Sounds like chaos.
It was, you can't imagine. And we did this for 4 years, and each year became more successful. And each year, the Ministry of Culture of Azerbaijan, which is one of our partners, disliked our success more and more. And they, 20 years later, I understand how unintentionally Americans coming in and creating something so successful where local traditions were such a big part of that success that there was some resentment.
Sure.
But the resentment wasn't so much artistic resentment. It was like the ministry saw how much money could be made off of a festival if they ran it, right, and, controlled the resources. And I wasn't at all interested in selling tickets to anything, and never once did we sell tickets. Now, because we weren't selling the tickets, we had a system where anyone could come to our office, take 4 tickets total, and use those 4 tickets. Well, scalpers would come and take 4 tickets, and then you would see them just outside of our office selling the tickets for like $20. That's how popular the concerts were.
Wow.
we started in the second year, we started a youth big band. That tradition continues to the day. I was in Azerbaijan.
Really? That's still going on.
15 years later, and some of the kids who were like, 14 and 15-year-old saxophonists, super talented, were then, like the 40-year-old, main sax players in Azerbaijan. And it was great to see how those educational aspects of what we were doing had actually helped some people in their careers later on. But we stopped the festival after the fourth year because the pipeline had been finished and the oil was flowing out. And surprise, surprise, the corporate interests were no longer interested in supporting our festival. Once they had finished their pipeline work, the corporate sponsorship dried up. It became almost impossible to work with the Ministry of Culture. And I said, okay, look, we've built up the festival, you can take it over. And they promptly changed the name and started charging $100 per ticket and running the festival in the jazz club. So we used to run the festival for audiences of 2,000, and they would run the festival for audiences of 200 people paying $100 a night. So it became
what you didn't want it to be.
Became exactly what we didn't want it to be. And it became exactly something for what they call the new Azerbaijanis, so the wealthy people attached to the business world and the government world, and it became something completely different. All the educational initiatives were dropped, and at the same time we were running that festival, we were sending groups out to Turkmenistan and running a smaller version of the festival in Kazakhstan for 2 years. And that was also very eye-opening to run jazz programs in Kazakhstan, which was even thirstier than the Azerbaijanis for jazz just because of their geographic isolation.
Right. So, and how long did that last?
Well, as a festival for 2 years, and again, it just became too difficult to deal with the local authorities. Mm-hmm. But then we started making a program with mini festival. This is what turned into Jazz Bridges. The jazz festivals became Jazz Bridges, and these became programs where we would bring in one American group that would tour around to very windswept, God-forsaken oil towns like Aktau on the Caspian and Atirau on the Caspian and Ust-Kamenogorsk and, places like this that were just wonderful cities full of well-educated people thirsty for these kind of programs, but there was just nothing there for them. So we would be, the big excitement every year. So we started those kind of programs, prioritizing easier to manage programs and calling them Jazz Bridges Kazakhstan, and took artists like Deborah Brown, the jazz and blues singer from Kansas City, Mike Del Ferro from Amsterdam, Coco York, other jazz artists. We would take them and tour them around and have them collaborate with local traditional artists. We took Jesse Dayton, a country singer there once, branched out into country music, very popular.
Did that go over well?
Yeah, and the country music just blended so well with the dobro and all of these Kazakh, dotar, all these Kazakh stringed instruments, So it was exciting times, and that's where the Jazz Bridges model for programming emerged, which we eventually took to Afghanistan in 2006.
Wow.
It was like our first large-scale program. Our first program in Afghanistan, a very large scale. It was the first American-themed concert there in 25 years, something like that. So, again, had a huge resonance.
2006 in Afghanistan, that must have been interesting.
Well, those were the golden years when security was fantastic.
Huh.
And we built our program around the Afghan Elvis.
Laili, 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 John, 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 dil mat kar di wairan. Laili, 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 John, 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 dil mat kar di wairan. Dai kishlaq namadi, wai, wai, mar kushti varman. Dai kishlaq namadi, wai, wai, mar kushti varman.
Of course. Ahmad Zahir, as one does. Because Afghan friends of mine had said, "Oh, you're going to Afghanistan. Well, you need to know Ahmad Zahir." And so Ahmad Zahir took Elvis songs, translated them into Dari.
Cool.
and sang them accompanied by Afghan traditional instruments.
Oh my God, I'd love to see
And
that.
our tabla player, Mohammed, I forget his last name, he used to be Ahmad Zahir's tabla player in Ahmad Zahir's band. So that was a very popular program of jazz, blues, collaborations, mixing it up between Afghan traditions and jazz, and then just, the Ahmad Zahir songs performed by Afghan musicians.
So at this point, you've built this reputation of, it doesn't sound all that intentionally. You kind of go where the wind blows, but you've built this reputation of building programs in far off, distant places that not a lot of people go to.
Yeah.
Is that what led to the work starting in the Middle East? How did that all come to fruition?
Basically, by the early 2000s, we were running the Jazz Festival in Azerbaijan. We were doing Broadway Bridges programs where we were taking excerpts from musicals like West Side Story, going to the opera programs in conservatories in Russia, and Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan.
Uzbekistan, I think I saw a
Uzbekistan
video
also,
of that.
yeah. And we would be like the first Broadway show. We were just doing excerpts, from West Side Story or Grease or whichever musical was at hand. When we did that in Kazakhstan and Almaty in 2002, West Side Story with local singers and Ira Spalding conducting and singing one of the solo parts, and me at the piano. There was no orchestra. It was just me at the piano. But public reaction was so strong, and the hall was too small. We had 800-seat hall, that the students, it was at the Almaty Conservatory, the students knew how to sneak into the hall through basement windows. So they were climbing in through windows, and people from the embassy were saying, we've got to lock the doors from the inside because we can't let any more people in. There was literally no place for anyone to stand or sit. It was so full.
Wow.
Complete fire hazard, but whatever.
Yeah, right.
And one of the people we locked out was our main sponsor from ExxonMobil. Who was not happy the next day. He was not even happy that, there'd been such a great response to the program. But, we got better at crowd control after that. But there, if you were like the first Broadway show or the first breakdancers B-boy program in Vietnam or Azerbaijan, huge turnout. And then you would discover in every country you went, no matter how isolated or how geographically far away or politically how strange, that there would always be B-boys wherever you went. They would turn up for the B-boy program. There would always be aspiring Broadway singers whose vision of Broadway was from movies they saw on TV, like Grease or Disney musicals. But you would always find those kids there who wanted to learn, and they would come to your show and you would meet them. But I realized that, this is really a demographic, we should want to engage. And that's how the Academy program started, where you would go into a country and spend 2 weeks and really try to introduce people to Broadway, to jazz, to hip-hop dance, to music production, to rapping and beatboxing, to youth orchestra, to chamber music, open up their minds to all different aspects of performing arts with a focus on unique American genres.
Is that what is a Yes Academy then?
That's the Yes Academy, Youth Excellence on Stage.
Right.
So the Yes Academy was born during a incoming mortar warning in Baghdad. Under a desk. I was meeting with the cultural affairs officer.
What year was that?
2007.
2007.
So American Voices that had been invited to Baghdad to perform in the Green Zone with the Iraq National Symphony Orchestra in a program of Broadway songs and Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue. So I went with a Broadway performer named Michael Parks, and I was piano soloist, and we worked together with them. We met with the National Dance Company. We met with various arts organizations to try to get an overview of what was going on in Baghdad, what was still functioning, and how they could best be supported by the embassy. So it was kind of a consulting visit, but also a performing visit. And our big show was on February 17th, 2007, which happened to be the day that Condoleezza Rice flew in to announce the surge. So our show almost didn't happen, but it did happen, but to very little audience because everyone was drawn to the press conference by Condoleezza Rice. But it was really very dicey situation there. There were always incoming mortars and things, and you would be, walking through the green zone and you would hear the siren warning. You would have to jump into a protected space. And I was meeting with the cultural affairs officer. She's like, this went really well. We went to do more. I have this enormous budget of $2 million. You have to help me spend this money. Wow. And I'm like, well, we can help you with that.
Right.
And I put together, I've never been there, but I've been hearing about this region called Kurdistan, which is supposedly has a much better security situation. Let me go check it out, and then I'll get back to you. And then we put together a program that brought together all of Iraq's orchestras on one stage, so orchestras from Baghdad, Erbil, Suleimania. We had a children's theater program. We had hip-hop dance. We had conducting program. We had a very wide-ranging program that was 10 days long with about 300 participants in a space that was woefully small. For some reason, I thought I could manage it all myself with the help of local staff. But the staff that had been assigned were not really up to the task from the Ministry of Culture. So it was a big, like my big fat Greek wedding. It was my big messy first Yes Academy in Iraq. In the city of Erbil, excellent security. The participants were, thrilled. We were the first Americans who had ever come there to do something musical, to perform, to teach. The people coming up from Baghdad had known us from the previous February program. And the U.S. Embassy and the military were coming up to film B-roll from the program because it was so interesting and there was such a strong reaction to it. But the situation technically in Erbil, Erbil's now a transformed place, 15 years later, but back then the situation was very undeveloped, so like sound systems were in short supply, functioning microphones were in short supply. Local people who knew how to operate microphones and sound systems. Electricity was in short supply. If you didn't have generator fuel in the generator, you weren't going to have AC, and it was 125 degrees outside. It's Arizona hot there. So it was really crazy. And, we just learned the hard way that first time how many details had to be tended to run a program successfully.
So what was the situation for a young music student or a young Yes Academy? What was a young classical musician dealing with before you guys were able to work with them?
So again, there's like Baghdad and there's the rest of Iraq. So Baghdad had good Soviet-style performing arts education system in place with a lot of teachers coming on contract from the former Soviet Union. And that started back, I think, in the 70s. But by the time of the first Gulf War in 1991, a lot of people left and they didn't trust the situation anymore and didn't come back. So Baghdad lost a lot of its best teachers at that point, and the education system for performing arts began to kind of steep decline. And by the time of the 2003 invasion, virtually all of those teachers had left. There was one Czech piano teacher who stayed on in Baghdad after 2003. Because she was married to an Iraqi, but otherwise a lot of the brain power behind performing arts education in Iraq had left, and the best trained Iraqis, the most talented Iraqis had left as well because of all the financial problems. So you kind of walked into a post-brain drain, talent drain landscape where there used to be a lot of infrastructure and a lot of support, and now it was just on life support. So the orchestras were barely hanging on. The institutes of fine arts, which were teacher training academies all over the country in Kurdistan, in every city, were training people to teach in the public schools as music teachers or art teachers or theater teachers. Those were still in place. But you just didn't have teachers in those schools. And the teachers you had often weren't qualified. So the students were kind of like going through the motions of getting educations at the universities and institutes of fine arts and the School of Music and Dance, but often just didn't have qualified teachers. So almost all the teaching you did was remedial. And there was very little internet in Iraq around this time in 2007. You couldn't stream a video from, I mean, YouTube was only 2 years old then, but you couldn't stream a video and that sort of thing. So kids were just in a vacuum. If they weren't exposed to these things at their school or through television, they just didn't know about it. But as the internet came in and YouTube University, as I like to call it, became available, kids started to be more aware. But it's still like the main goal of the Yes Academy programs was to train the next generation of teachers and cultural leaders, as well as performers. But the main goal was not performance, but to help train a younger generation that was equipped to lead the country forward out of the post-2003 disaster that they were in.
Mm. I know that there's a Yes Academy in Lebanon.
Right.
And can you give me a little bit of history of how that happened? And I know that you guys were teaching during that massive explosion that went off. Was that 2 years ago now?
Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious at some point to hear what that was like, but also just how did that program start?
So the Yes Academy Iraq started in 2007. Yes Academy Lebanon started in 2009 with support from the Levant Foundation, the Jamal Daniel family in Houston, Texas. He's Syrian-American, married to a Lebanese American. They're very interested in interfaith and intercultural activities in the Levant region. So they were very nice to support the first 2 years of Yes Academy in Lebanon, which had the goal of really trying to bring young people from all kinds of confessional backgrounds and socioeconomic backgrounds together. So we really tried to have under one roof every major region of Lebanon, every major confessional group, Palestinian refugees, Iraqi refugees. We tried to have a very inclusive program. And it was a very big program in the beginning with focus on hip hop and Broadway and youth orchestra and so forth. We had about close to 250 participants in the beginning. So that program got off to a great start. It reached a lot of kids coming from all over the country, and we were, bringing kids from far away and housing them and feeding them and so forth. And it was, the only Broadway training available in Lebanon. It was the only hip-hop dance training available in Lebanon. It was the only youth orchestra in Lebanon.
Right.
There were some efforts in Lebanon through the National Conservatory, but again, Lebanon had been through so many crises by that point, the 2006 bombing by Israel and, recovering from the civil war, that most well-trained Lebanese had left the country. And there again, we're walking into a post-brain drain kind of landscape. Mm-hmm. So we started that program working with American institutions in Hamra, which is kind of the main neighborhood of Beirut, where you have the main universities and a lot of big government institutions, National Bank and so forth. Working in Hamra, which was very central to some aspects of the country, but not as very central for a lot of the orchestral musicians, for example. But we worked on the campus of the American University of Beirut in the beginning, and then eventually decided we had to move to a more central location, and we moved the program to near Joigny, about 30 kilometers up the coast. So we were kind of like in the middle of the country. So that program continues to this day. Now it's mostly focused on orchestra and composition and piano. We do some work with songwriting and Broadway as well. Mm-hmm. We had to drop a lot of the hip hop programming, unfortunately, but it's still a very dynamic program. It's still the only youth orchestra that strives to bring kids from every corner of the country together to learn more about orchestral playing and chamber music.
Yeah. I know you don't always think of it in these terms, but to think about how many young people's lives you're impacting with this kind of stuff. I feel very lucky because I've been able to get to know several of those people, including Alan, who we'll also be talking to.
Right.
And I guess that's a decent transition into talking about the scholarship program that American Voices has built, that you're trying to grow.
Right.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, just one final thought about
Please.
Yes Academies. So the Iraq Academy, it's in its 15th iteration now. Mm-hmm. And what I'm seeing now, which I'm very pleased with, is that people who came to us as students in their late teens and early 20s 15 years ago are now, heading the music program at the Institute of Fine Arts in Sulaymaniyah, or they're, emerging as the best violin teacher in Erbil, or the only flute teacher in Kirkuk, or running a children's orchestra in Mosul, something like that. So we're seeing that the kids we've been training in the early years are now sending their students to us, and even coming to us for some teacher training and pedagogical training. And some of those students have come through our scholarship program, like Alan, you mentioned, was in our first iteration of the program. So the scholarship program started in 2008 as a way to help some of these most talented and motivated young people we were meeting in Iraq and Lebanon. It was a community partnership in St. Louis, where we're headquartered. We brought together the St. Louis University ESL, English as a Second Language program, who provided free scholarships for 2 semesters of English language training for 2 students, together with St. Louis Symphony Youth Orchestra and private teachers and other arts organizations in the city, and kind of pieced together a program that had the English language training with the musical training so that students could use that year to get ready to pass their TOEFL test, audition for university programs, and leverage the whole year in St. Louis into a fully supported full scholarship program somewhere in the United States. So we've had 2 students go on to full scholarships at Oberlin, for example. Several went on to go just across the river to Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. We've had students on scholarship in Waco, Texas at Baylor University, different universities around the United States. Our current cohort includes 2 Afghan students that I taught briefly in Kabul in 2010 and 11 in a kind of winter academy at the Afghan National Institute of Music. So Elham Fanous, pianist, and Milad Yusufi, composer. They're part of our scholarship program. They're both in graduate degree programs right now in New York City.
Yeah, I heard one of them talk about how he's going to be releasing like the first piano album by an Afghan piano player.
Right.
And I could tell how moved he was by that, let alone by me hearing it. It was amazing.
No, they're amazing kids, and they had that wonderful experience with great teachers at the Afghan National Institute of Music. Several of those teachers that they had, like Avery Waite and Kim Mai Nguyen, teach at our Yes Academies in the summer now. So they are teachers that had this wonderful experience working with these talented kids in Afghanistan and now work with us in the summertime in Iraq and Lebanon.
This stuff isn't cheap to do for people.
No, to help a student, we're spending anywhere between $5,000 per year and $20,000 per year, just supporting their education and supplemental activities. We have an amazing young talent from Eritrea, Ben-Hur, who's this kind of baritone, bass. He's going to kill me if I said baritone. A bass, basso. He's a bass opera singer that I discovered in Eritrea on a tour. Mm-hmm. And Eritrea is, again, known as being something like, the North Korea of Africa, very, very isolated, very closed off to the rest of the world. And there was this kid singing beautifully in Italian and German. And there was this little pocket of young, ambitious opera singers in Eritrea. We invited him on our scholarship program. He's now on a full scholarship at Oberlin. And we help him with his summer training. This summer he studied at Brevard Institute in their opera program. And we help him with participating in competitions and additional lessons and trainings.
And there's more than that, too, because one of the things I love about this organization is it's not like you're just throwing money at these people. I saw pictures of Jacob, who also works for American Voices, helping him move out of his dorm. And it's not just a drop money and forget it. We're all kind of involved in the process. And I think that's important and more sincere than other times I've seen things like this. So,
and we're also expanding the scholarship program now to include some limited number of students who are studying outside the United States. So we're supporting 2 of our most talented Iraqi-based hip-hop dancers. They're actually Syrians living in a refugee camp called Dashakan outside of Erbil. Öcalan and Ali are poppers and lockers, so they do a very specific kind of hip-hop dance. So we're helping them with their bachelor's degree and also helping them through some online training that's provided by Google and so forth in graphic design and network administration and these kind of hard skills that will help them in their employment opportunities in the future. So, the scholarship program is an important and growing part of what we do. Unfortunately, because we've gone virtual as an office, we're still based in St. Louis, but the office doesn't have a lot of hands on deck. We're spread out all over the country now. We've stopped the partnership with St. Louis University after 12 years and are now focusing on students who are enrolled or enrolling in graduate or undergraduate degree programs and helping them that way.
So if you're a university and you're listening to this podcast and want to partner with American Voices, is that something we're always looking for?
Please. And it's amazing how many universities are really interested in bringing these kinds of students into their midst, because it's a great diversity lesson and lesson in, cultural exchange, to have someone from Eritrea singing opera in your opera program or a pianist from Afghanistan.
I don't know if you said this. I mean, he's at Oberlin.
Oberlin, yeah.
I mean, one of the finest music schools in the world.
Yeah.
And which, I mean, I still think of American Voices as kind of scrappy organization. And, here you find this amazingly talent in a remote country, and Oberlin's like, please, I think that's evidence of how effective the things you are doing are. So we've talked a lot about the Yes Academies, the scholarships. I'm curious how these kinds of things have changed you, being able to go and have these experiences and, and help people in the situations that they're in get as close to a fair music education as possible, or dance or whatever art. How has that changed you over the years?
I guess my only regret is I didn't get into a lot of these countries earlier, but the chronology of things, it was sort of difficult to get into the Soviet Union while it was still the Soviet Union, or into Iraq in the 70s or 80s. But I guess everything, comes in due time. But as a teacher, because I teach piano, as a pianist, I'm working with pianists in Iraq. I always wish I could do more, and I've contemplated, going there and working year round just to, work with these young pianists. But you start to realize that there's a lot of attention being paid to pianists from a very limited number of countries in the world. So I would say most pianists come from G20 countries, But what's crazy is virtually any country you go to in the world, any country you go to, if you go as a pianist, you're going to meet some cohort of local young pianists who are passionate about the piano. Even some place where you think that it wouldn't exist, you're going to meet opera singers in Eritrea, or you're going to meet b-boys in Vietnam, you're going to meet a violinist in Iraq, so these kids are there and they're very isolated.
Mm-hmm.
So what I like to say is encourage young musicians, being trained in the States and Europe. If you want to make your music matter, get out of your little Western comfortable box or your comfortable Asian box and get into some situation where you're training kids who are unable to access the education that you are able to have through your socioeconomic advantages. You can, spin the globe and you can put your finger anywhere and you're going to find some kids who want to learn about what you know about. And that's what I would like to encourage everyone to do. And now with Zoom, you don't have to go to Micronesia to teach pianists in Micronesia. You can teach them online. You can work with the b-boys in Iraq online. All of this can be done with Zoom. It can be done, in person as well, but it needs to be done. There's a lot of work to be done out there. And I encourage everyone to look beyond their comfort zones and what they know and go out of their box and look for new opportunities to help people with their art forms.
What do you think Americans are missing by not putting themselves out there like that, leaving the country, meeting people from other cultures?
They're missing everything I haven't lived in the States. I've been living in the States this past year due to the pandemic. I'm normally based in Bangkok and do a fair amount of, back and forth between the United States and Thailand and the other countries I work in. But I would say that leaving the United States as I did in 1989, first for Europe for 13 years, and then being based out of Bangkok for the past 16 years, that having this kind of international experience is invaluable. But I would also say, and this is what I know from my work in North Carolina in the 80s, this kind of cultural diplomacy, you can do it at home as well. There's a lot of kids probably within a 2-mile radius of your home who don't have the economic and social advantages you do, but still want to be pianists, or they still want to be breakdancers, or they still want to be songwriters, and just need that kind of mentoring and that kind of attention. So if the idea of working outside the United States or building bridges outside of the States doesn't appeal to you, do it in your own community, do it in your own neighborhood, do it in the neighborhood across the tracks. There's plenty of opportunities everywhere to reach out and make a difference.
I think every musician has that point where they can trace back to why they became a musician.
Yeah.
And you can be that
Yeah.
source for somebody to inspire a young person to endeavor to be a musician. And I think we both would agree there's nothing more powerful than realizing that happened because you put yourself in a situation where that could happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. This is a good question. You've spent a lot of time abroad blending American culture with other cultures, music and arts, and which is really cool and exciting. What do you think is missing for that to happen in the United States more? Why isn't that happening here more?
Well, when you try, so I've been to 150 countries. So I've seen other countries that are a lot like the United States in this sense. You go to Brazil or Turkey, or maybe to Japan, for example. There's a lot of countries like us that are very insulated and very isolated, because of our wealth, because of our, success, if you want to call it that, because of our many strengths, and because our language is kind of like
Universal.
the global universal language, it's easy for us just to stay in the States and live our comfortable lives and not venture out. And, very little will happen in an average American day to make you think about the outside world or to confront you with the outside world. Maybe if you met a refugee and spoke to them, you might have some idea about what's going on, but it often takes a more intense level of engagement to be kind of woken up by contact with the outside world. So that's what I would encourage people to do, even if it means just joining a Zoom group with people from another country that share your interest in piano or singing or songwriting, whatever it is. Put yourself out there and try to meet other people.
Mm-hmm.
And learn languages. That's another great way to be able to understand people.
Sure. I mean, I agree. And I don't think we all need to be John Ferguson. I know you speak Dutch, you speak French. I'm not a multilingual person, but I know very well, as you did when you went to Azerbaijan, that if you spend an hour learning some key phrases, if you have a moment to respect their culture by learning a few words, you make friends so fast.
Yeah.
That could be in Azerbaijan. That could be down the street in St. Louis, where you have a neighbor that's from Central America. Learn a few words in Spanish, you've got a friend. And so I love that you set that example. I love hearing about how even in the early days, you were taking the time to learn language.
Just a few words,
right.
To say hi from the stage and thank you. Just those few words,
Yeah.
That, especially if it's in a really kind of remote language that nobody locally thinks an American's going to take. If you learn how to say that in Estonian or in Tigrinya in Eritrea, it goes a really long way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's not much in this an American culture that encourages us to think internationally and to think globally and to get involved. I would say church groups and mission trips are probably the most engaged Americans internationally,
Yeah.
And then kids who were fortunate enough to go on, high school summer abroad programs or junior year study abroads that will open your eyes. But I think it's only when you go to places where the economies and the opportunities and everything is so different from what you grew up with that you kind of get jolted into a global reality. I remember traveling with musicians the first time in Cambodia, and first time they saw people living in thatched bamboo huts, and they're like, "What's that?" And it's like, "Well, that's their house." But how do they live in something like that? Well, that's what they live in.
Right. I know that experience too. I've spent a lot of time in Africa, and I've watched band members experience what I experienced for the first time, and it has this profound effect on you when you in an instant how fortunate you are and what you were given, and you didn't even know it,
and how that good fortune can be a straitjacket too if you don't venture out.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we're not here to get political, but I think that if everybody had a better view of how the rest of the world actually lives, I think things would be different right now. So, well, I think this was a wonderful conversation. I do think it's important for people to recognize that American Voices can't do what it does without support from the people who are already donating and being very generous with the organization. But we're always looking for more because the whole crew here follows your lead in trying to help young musicians around the world. So I definitely want to say, because you don't always say it enough, like, please consider donating to American Voices, because I see firsthand every day the effect that has and the ability that gives this organization to continue growing and stuff. So
yeah, you can go to AmericanVoices.org and find the links for donating. And we'll be, in the course of these podcasts, you'll have a chance to meet the performers and teachers that go out to these Yes Academies, some of our scholarship students, and some of the different personalities around the world that make the organization tick. So I think stay tuned. There's a lot of people far more interesting than me that are coming up that are going to have some.
I would argue with you about that. But I believe the second episode will be with Alan Elias. Is that the correct way to say his name?
Alan Elias, who's from Kurdistan.
Right.
He's working at American Voices now, managing one of the programs we manage for State Department. But he started as a violinist in our first Yes Academy program in Iraq in 2007, was in the first batch of scholarship students in St. Louis in 2008, and has finished 2 degrees in the United States in music, and is now married and an American citizen.
Yeah, I could say this because I'm not you, because I started working with American Voices as an employee about a year ago, and I didn't know. I knew you, I knew Jacob, and then I met Alan, and like it struck me pretty hard that the mission meets the road in the office, because here's somebody who was in one of the first Yes Academies who now works for American Voices. And like, I think there's something so powerful about that.
And he runs a much tighter ship at the Yes Academy in Iraq now than I ever could, because he knows Kurdish, he knows Arabic, and he knows the culture and his culture, and he runs a great program there, and a great teacher, a great administrator.
And I'm excited to talk to him more about it, because talking with him about office stuff is one thing, but actually I want to hear his story straight from him. So, well, cool, John. Thanks for this. Thanks for tuning in to the Arts on the Edge podcast. If you haven't already, please make sure to follow American Voices on social media. On Facebook, that's at AM Voices. And on Instagram, you can find us at American.Voices. Please visit www.americanvoices.org to learn how you can help us grow. See you next month.